In our last episode, we tracked the unbelievable rise of Adolf Hitler. From a failed Austrian artist and a penniless drifter, he weaponized a global economic crisis to legally become the Chancellor of Germany. Now let's find out how this man went from a local politician to unleashing absolute hell on the entire world. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler officially took office as Chancellor. The old guard politicians in Berlin were still back at their offices, smirking and thinking they could easily control this failed artist like a puppet on a string. But boy, were they wrong. They wanted to pull Hitler's strings. But Hitler was about to cut theirs entirely. Less than a month into his term, on the night of February 27, 1933, a massive fire erupted from the Reichstag, the German parliament building. The ultimate symbol of German democracy burned to the ground. Who did it? The police caught a young, mentally unstable Dutch communist at the scene. Hitler instantly seized the moment, pointed a finger, and screamed to the German public, "See, I told you so. The communists are launching a revolution to burn this country to the ground. Everyone step aside. I'll handle this." The very next day, Hitler pressured the president into signing an emergency decree, suspending all civil liberties overnight. Freedom of speech? Gone. Freedom of assembly? Gone. The Nazi police now had the legal right to tap phones, open private mail, and arrest anyone they didn't like without a warrant. He immediately threw all his political rivals into newly built concentration camps. By 1934, when the aging president Hindenburg passed away, Hitler decided to scrap the presidency altogether. He merged the offices of Chancellor and President into one supreme role and gave himself a brand new, terrifying title: the Führer. In less than a year, German democracy was officially dead, replaced by the totalitarian dictatorship of the Third Reich. The old guard politicians could only stare at each other in utter shock. He'll be easy to control, right, boys? Yeah, good luck surviving his reign now. With absolute power secured, Hitler turned his eyes toward the map of Europe, ready to launch a grand campaign of revenge. That grand revenge began with a massive, illegal military buildup pumping out tanks and fighter jets at breakneck speed. By law, Britain and France should have stepped in and crushed him right there and then. But there was a catch. Both powers were still bleeding from the Great Depression, and they were so terrified of another world war that they preferred to look the other way. Seeing how spineless his neighbors were, Hitler started playing the ultimate schoolyard bully on a continental scale. His strategy was simple: take first, ask for forgiveness later. In 1936, Hitler aggressively marched his troops into the demilitarized Rhineland. Britain and France broke into a cold sweat but basically told each other, it's their own backyard anyway, let it slide. Since this was so easy, in 1938, Hitler marched in and annexed his homeland of Austria. Britain and France shrugged again, saying, well, Austrians speak German too, so it kind of makes sense. But seriously, promise this is the last time. Hitler crossed his fingers, promised it was the end of it, and immediately demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. At this point, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew over to Germany to handle it. Hitler swore on his honor that this was his absolute final territorial demand in Europe. Chamberlain fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. He flew back home, waved the treaty in front of a cheering crowd, and famously declared, "I believe it is peace for our time." Yeah, that peace for our time lasted exactly 6 months. Hitler swallowed the rest of Czechoslovakia while the world watched in utter disbelief. Britain and France finally woke up and realized they had been feeding a monster. They rushed to set a definitive red line. If you touch Poland, we are legally declaring war. Hitler looked at the red line and literally laughed. But just to cover his bases, he looked over to the east where another brutal dictator with an equally impressive mustache was running the show, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. The two guys despised each other, but out of nowhere, in August 1939, they signed a non-aggressive pact with a spicy secret clause. They were going to split Poland right down the middle. The stage was set. The Nazi war machine was officially off the leash. On September 1st, 1939, German troops rolled across the Polish border. 2 days later, Britain and France officially declared war. World War II was on. The Germans hit the ground running with a revolutionary, terrifying new military strategy. Blitzkrieg or Lightning War. Instead of sitting in muddy trenches playing a multi-year waiting game like in World War I, the Germans went all in. They used bomber planes to completely devastate enemy defenses, then unleashed thousands of tanks to punch holes through enemy lines at full speed, with motorized infantry following close behind to sweep up the mess. The strategy was devastatingly effective. Poland crumbled in weeks. Even worse, France, the country with what was supposed to be the strongest army in Europe, surrendered in just 6 weeks. Hitler was so ecstatic he literally did a victory jig at the surrender signing. Europe was in a total panic, leaving Great Britain, led by the bulldog British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, completely isolated and dodging non-stop German airstrikes. Sitting at the absolute top of the world, Hitler's ego expanded exponentially. He genuinely believed he was an invincible military mastermind, a god of war, and in the summer of 1941, he made the ultimate fatal blunder. He ripped up his pact with Stalin and launched Operation Barbarossa, a full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union. At first, Blitzkrieg worked like a charm. German forces tore through Soviet territory, capturing millions of prisoners and marching right up the gates of Moscow. Hitler sneered, convinced Russia would fold in a couple of weeks. But he miscalculated big time. Russia wasn't France. Russia had endless, unforgiving space, millions of people willing to die for the motherland, and most importantly, they had a secret weapon: General Winter. When the temperature plummeted to -30, then -40 degrees, the German army entered a world of pain. Hitler was so overconfident about a quick victory that he had only issued his troops summer uniforms. Now German soldiers were freezing to death in the snow, engine oil turned to ice, tanks wouldn't start, and guns jammed. And right when the Germans were shivering to their bones, the Soviet Red Army launched a massive counter-offensive. Hitler's unstoppable streak officially went up in smoke at the bloody Battle of Stalingrad. While the war raged on with absolute brutality across the front lines, a much darker, systemic horror was unfolding in the background. Under the direct orders of Hitler and his inner circle, the Third Reich was quietly executing the most gruesome crime in human history: the final solution. Now, this nightmare didn't just pop out of nowhere. Hitler had been laying the groundwork since day one. It started with the Nuremberg Laws, which stripped Jews of their citizenship, banned them from marrying Germans, and kicked Jewish kids out of schools. Then in 1938, hatred turned into flat-out violence during Kristall Nacht, the Night of Broken Glass. Nazi mobs destroyed thousands of Jewish shops, burned synagogues to the ground, and dragged families into the streets. The world watched, and the world did nothing. And that silence greenlit something far worse. Once the war started, it wasn't just discrimination anymore. It became an industrialized, meticulously planned, and cold-blooded genocide. A vast network of concentration and extermination camps, such as Auschwitz and Treblinka, were constructed across occupied Europe. Over 6 million Jews, alongside millions of Poles, Soviets, people with disabilities, and other minorities, were stripped of their dignity and property. They were packed into dark, suffocating cattle trains, trapped for days without food or water. Upon arrival, the elderly, women, and children were immediately marched into gas chambers under the guise of taking a communal shower. Within minutes, they were murdered en masse, and their bodies were obliterated in industrial crematoriums that burned day and night. Those deemed fit to work were simply worked to death, turned into walking skeletons until they finally collapsed. Behind the grand military parades and the intoxicating propaganda lay the true, hollow core of the Nazi regime: unmitigated, systematic cruelty. The Holocaust remains the darkest stain on the 20th century, a chilling, permanent reminder of what happens when radical ideology and unchecked hatred are handed absolute power. By 1945, Hitler's game was officially over. From the west, the Allies crossed the Rhine. From the east, the Soviet Red Army was a tidal wave of pure vengeance, flattening everything in its path to march straight into Berlin. The Great Führer was now a trembling 56-year-old man, his left hand twitching uncontrollably, hiding out in a concrete bunker 30 feet beneath the burning capital. His paranoia had completely broken the scale. He spent his final days screaming at maps, ordering non-existent armies that had been wiped out weeks ago to launch counterattacks and save Berlin. Hitler: Steiner's army will attack from the north and crush the Soviets. General: My Führer, Steiner didn't have enough men. The attack: Steiner's army doesn't exist anymore. Hitler: Everyone has betrayed me. The war is lost. On April 29, 1945, realizing the jig was up, Hitler did something he had never done before. He got married. He tied the knot with his long-term mistress, Eva Braun, in a quick, depressing bunker ceremony. The very next day, on April 30th, with Soviet artillery shells literally shaking the bunker ceiling, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun walked into their private room and committed suicide. Their bodies were immediately carried up to the Reich Chancellor Garden, drenched in gasoline and burned to ash so they wouldn't be captured as trophies. 2 days later, Berlin surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Adolf Hitler started as a nobody, a failed artist, and a homeless drifter rejected by society. But through a toxic cocktail of hypnotic charisma, sheer political ruthlessness, a desperate German public, and a clueless, appeasing world, he became the ultimate tyrant of human history. His promised 1,000-year Reich lasted exactly 12 years, but it left behind a ruined continent, tens of millions of dead, and a chilling warning for humanity. Democracy and peace are incredibly fragile. If we fall asleep at the wheel and let hatred and radical extremism take the driver's seat, the nightmare of the Third Reich can happen all over again. Thanks for watching this 2-part series. If you enjoyed it, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and leave a comment below on which historical figure you want to see next. Goodbye and see you next time.